Welcome to your Week 2 lecture in Social and Political Theory. This week we're looking at structural functionalism. Though now debunked, for most of the 20th century, structural functionalism was the dominant sociological approach in the West. So even though it's now debunked as a social theory, we, or if not us, then at least the rest of the outside world, seems still to behave as though this is the way that society actually works. So, the structural functionalist perspective is largely based on the works of Herbert Spencer, Emile Durkheim, Talcott Parsons, Robert Merton. Basically, it gives us a macro view of society, where the focus is on the structures that give shape to society, and through those structures, shape individual action. So, one of the ways that structural functionalists describe how society works is to rely on the analogy of a cell or a human body. And according to this tradition, society is a system of interconnected parts that need to work together in harmony to do their job. So, it seems to rely on this idea that in order to understand how a particular institution in society works, what we need to do is look at how it contributes to the functioning of the whole. So institutions in this context comprise marriage, the church, the legal system and justice, the education system, and all of these, according to this theory, are interconnected parts of the larger functioning whole that relies on all of these functioning properly and in interconnection with each other to result in an equilibrium in society. So the desirable state, according to this theory, is one of equilibrium. Social change isn't something that's desired. In fact, what we want is for things in this theory is for things not to change, for things to stay the same. And this is what is described as equilibrium or proper social functioning. So again, remember that this theory is a lens through which to look at society and social action. I'm describing this theory to you so that you can try it on and see how it works, and also because it becomes interesting in terms of like the wider sociological scope, I guess, of the theories that we're looking at, to look at how understandings of society and the role of particular institutions in society, such as the family and religion, have changed, and also to look at the role of particular social movers. So, in structural functionalist theory, the idea of crisis or social change is seen as a bad thing. Society wants to be in stasis, at equilibrium. In some of the theories we'll look at in following weeks, for instance, week 3 when we look at Marxism, one of the underlying assumptions is that social change and crisis are a good thing and that society moves towards change and bettering itself through crisis. So, because structural functionalism carries within it the underlying assumption that all the parts of society are connected and in balance, it also carries an underlying assumption that there is a why society is the way it is, or at least that the question, what purpose do all of the parts serve in the overall functioning of society, is a useful question to ask. So again, the theory likens society as a whole to a biological organism, where you can look at, say the human body and ask what function does the spleen serve in the overall maintenance and regulation of the human body. And the answer given in biology is that the spleen serves to regulate the immune system, that it provides certain enzymes, certain hormonal interactions, and therefore the human body works properly when the spleen is in balance. So it implies, though, structural functionalism implies an overall pattern, as though there is almost as though society was designed, or almost as though society evolved to this perfect point, and now it is in this state of equilibrium, as though the current form of society that we see around us is the example of a society at stasis, at rest, in equilibrium. The idea then is that if one part of society is out of balance, then the same as in an organism, when one part is out of balance, then the whole organism is sick. In fact, sickness is a metaphor that's commonly used in structural functional theory. Now, Durkheim looked at the causal functions, that is, studying why a structure or institution exists overall in society. So Durkheim, for instance, looked at the functioning of religion in society, and he theorized that religion's function is to serve as a mechanism that allows people to represent to themselves their society and their role in it. So basically, the function that religion serves as a structure that keeps society healthy is it presents you with a picture, and in that picture you can see the rest of society and you can see your role in it, so it lets you see an overall shape around social cohesion that you can imagine yourself as part of. So this, for Durkheim, was the function of religion. Spencer developed the underlying concepts of structure and function that underlie the theory of structural functionalism. So to Spencer, understanding society involves understanding the functions that various structures serve for society as a whole. So again, we can look at things like justice, or the heterosexual matrix, or marriage, education, the military, religion, and then look at what functions these serve for society as a whole to see why they are there. Now this is where some of the criticisms of this theory come into play. According to structural functionalists, if society is at stasis, in balance, in equilibrium at the moment, then certain functions, certain institutions and their functions in society are already working correctly. And so a good example of the problems that this theory started to provoke, I guess, was think of like the 1950s, the Mad Men style decade, with very traditional ideas of the family and sex roles that implied the woman stayed at home, looked after the children, looked after the house, and the men went out and worked. So the role of the family in society, according to a structural functionalist perspective, is a very conservative one, and one that doesn't allow room for people who aren't of the same sex or gender to get married, and that doesn't allow room for a different division of labour. The conservative, traditional idea of the family is the one that, say, works according to a structuralist, functionalist understanding. So this is where some of the problems come into it. When we look at some of the rapid change that society has undergone, especially our societies have undergone in the past few decades, around the role of women in society, around gendered equality, the role of the church as a guiding social force, even relationships between people of different racial backgrounds, ethnicities, division of labour, division of wealth. Any large change that society has seen, say, in the last 70 years, would be understood as counter to a smooth, static functioning of society, which the structural functionalists saw as the ideal. It's a theory that doesn't provide room for social change. It's, like I said, a theory that presents society at the moment as being at peace, in balance, and therefore any of these changes would have been something out of balance. Again, rather than a theory like Marxism that we'll look at next week that sees conflict in society as producing stronger, newer, better forms, structural functionalism looks at the way society functions at the present moment as a whole healthy organism. Okay, so there are, though, some uses to structural functionalism. There are some ways that it's still, as I said, it still seems to be widely used, even though, it's been actually debunked as a sociological theory. But if we look at wider society, there does seem to be this underlying assumption that you can ask what role something plays in society, and then that explains why it's there, as though society is an organism. So some of the ways that we can look at structural functionalism as a theory and see how it still might describe the workings within society is, I think, one of the more useful things that we can retain from the theory. So Talcott Parsons drew on Spencer to propose that all societies must meet certain needs to survive, that regardless of the particularities of the society, that all societies fill an adaptive function, that is, society must be able to adapt to different situations, a goal attainment function, they must be able to set goals for themselves and fulfill them, an integrative function, which is super important for this equilibrium model, that is, the ability to integrate dissident or different or migrant elements into the society and retain its original functioning in the first pattern, and latent pattern maintenance, that is, patterns within society that aren't showing yet but that happen like as a result of some of the functions in society. So Merton drew on Talcott Parsons to lay out a working theory that distinguished between manifest or intended functions and these latent or unintended ones. So the clearest example I can think of manifest and latent functions is the education system. The institution of the education system, its manifest function is to educate people, to teach young people how to work in this society, to teach them, to give them the skills they will need, to impart to them the knowledge they will need to become successful, productive members of society. So this is the manifest function of the education system. Its latent function, that is, things that happen as a result of the functioning of the institution that aren't necessarily its direct function but that happen anyway, are things around like socialization. Children don't just learn maths in school, they also learn how to get along with other children. They get socialized. There's probably other latent functions in there like respect for authority that they learn about their teachers. In higher examples of education, like high school or especially university, becomes a place where people don't just learn skills and knowledge, but they also create social networks, potentially meet their future partners. And a lot of these latent functionings of the education system are strongly seen to be ways in which like society perpetuates itself. Like these latent functions are just as important as the manifest functions. So again, Merton, who looked at and distinguished between manifest or intended and latent or unintended functions, noted he developed a theory that looked at, like, it sort of did this like four-way schema of like latent, manifest, functional and dysfunctional acts. So he looked at functional acts as ones that promote the agendas of the society or the group in society, and dysfunctional ones that don't. The same acts can actually be both functional and dysfunctional for the social whole, depending on context. So, for instance, crime, like simple crime, like someone breaking into a shop and stealing stuff, like that's obviously a dysfunctional act. It doesn't contribute towards the overall functioning of society. But Merton theorized that even though it's a dysfunctional act, it can have functional consequences for society as a whole. It strengthens the need for the police force. It strengthens people's understanding in the need for a justice system. It serves to reinforce morality around theft and property possession. And it further serves to reinforce the boundaries between correct behaviour and incorrect, and then our responses to the act serve to reinforce the boundaries between like proper law-abiding citizens who are within the walls, the legal structures of society, and the people connoted as criminal who are outside of those structures. And so overall this is very useful for society, for the social whole, to be able to draw these distinctions between I guess, us and them, between good people within society and criminals who are outside of society. So overall, the existence of crime in a structural functionalist perspective actually serves a purpose, which is why, in the structural functionalist perspective, there is such thing as crime. Crime serves a positive overall benefit for society. Now, in class, we also talked about the example of poverty. So from a structural functionalist perspective, poverty, which, as we see all around us and read about and see, poverty causes great social ills. It causes people to be cut off from access to resources, to education, to health, to have shorter lifespans. It's considered to be a social ill. Under a structural functionalist perspective, there are a number of benefits to poverty existing according to a big picture kind of approach. Poverty creates the aspiration for people to earn more money and aspire to being of a higher class level. Poverty, as in the example of crime, reinforces this division between the people who are successful and within the mores of society and those who are outside. There's a few other features that poverty serves. It functions to, what were some of the examples we came up with in class? It provides a subgroup of people on whom medical testing can happen because they have very little money, so these people will agree to have medical tests performed on them for scientific research. Similarly, it provides an underclass of people who will do the jobs that no one else wants, such as collecting garbage, say. So poverty then, which, in general we would consider widely to be a great social ill, in a structural functionalist perspective can seem to actually serve a purpose in the wider functioning of society. So from that sociological perspective, looking at the whole of society, I guess, then they look for the reasons for poverty to be there. So let's see, overall, structural functionalist theory, it looks at the overall functioning of society like an organism. And the metaphor of sickness can be brought in to describe aspects of, the society not functioning properly. There are also ways in which you can analyse sickness itself from a structuralist perspective, from a structural functionalist perspective. And in class we went through the Damien Milton attachment, the rights and obligations of the sick role. So in this exercise we followed Parsons' model, in which Talcott Parsons analysed the sick role, the role of the sick person. So the sick person, according to Parsons, can be expected to be afforded two rights. These rights, however, were conditional on the patient following two obligations, and if these obligations were not met, their rights as a sick person would be withdrawn. So as I talk through this, have a look at the handout, the Damien Milton one. So the rights. The sick person is temporarily exempt from performing normal social roles, such as going to work or housekeeping, and the more severe the sickness, the greater the exemption. Secondly, a genuine illness is seen as being beyond the control of the sick person and not curable by simple willpower and motivation. Therefore, the sick person should not be blamed for their illness, and they should be taken care of others until they can resume their normal social role. So you see, according to this model, the sick person has some rights. They have the right to be sick, they have the right to be looked after, they're not abandoned out on the hillside with no one to take care of them when they have the flu. On the other hand, they have a few obligations. The sick person is expected to see sick, or being sick, or sickness, as an undesirable state, and so they are under the obligation to try and get well as quickly as possible so they can resume their normal functioning within the mechanism of society. And after a certain time, the sick person must seek technically competent help, usually a doctor, and cooperate with the advice of the doctor in order to get better. So you see, this is a model of society which says that people need to perform their role. They need to function as a doctor or a garbage collector or a housewife, and they need to continue to perform that role. And it's not a theory in which there's space for people to suddenly step outside and say, this society doesn't need as many telephone sanitizers. It's a theory of society that says that everyone and every institution in society is already performing their role in the larger mechanism or the larger organism of society. Okay, so in the exercise, in the handouts from the class, go through the handout and read some of the descriptions of the structural functional perspective and have a go at the exercise where it asks you to reflect on the last time you were sick and then, what this was like in terms of your the responses of the people around you, how this theory describes your experience of being sick, just to see how the theory fits. Okay, so functionalists argue that in order for society to function, it has to place and motivate individuals to occupy the necessary positions in the social structure. And there are two main ways in which society does this. It must instill in the individuals the proper desire or motivation to fulfill certain positions, and this isn't always the motivation or the desire for financial rewards. It can be the motivation can be the desire for social capital or respect, or to feel fulfilled according to society's definitions of what a fulfilled life looks like. So then, once the proper individuals are in the positions, working as sociology teachers or garbage collectors or police people or doctors or whatever the roles are in society that needs to be filled, society must offer them appropriate rewards so that they maintain their desire to fulfill these difficult positions and continue to do so. So again, this is where not just financial rewards come in, but also the intangible rewards around respect and recognition and social, those sort of social rewards. Okay, so from a structural functionalist perspective, social problems represent the presence of dysfunction in the social system. Some element is not working as it should and something needs to change. However, functionalists are conservative by nature and thus emphasise slow reform rather than rapid change. And again, if you look at the metaphor of sickness, if something is not working, the idea is to fix the thing, the symptom, so that society will again be at equilibrium. Instead of seeing an aspect of social dysfunction or disequilibrium as indicating dysfunction in society as a whole, structural functionalists would see the dysfunction itself as being the problem, like a symptom of a disease, and so that's the thing that needs to be fixed. Social stability, then, is necessary for a strong society, and adequate socialisation and social integration are necessary for social stability, according to the theory. So society's social institutions perform important functions to help ensure social stability. And even structural functionalists recognise that slow social change is desirable. Obviously, society has to change somewhat as we move from a more individualist agrarian society to one where the means of production are mostly outside of the city and people inside the city feed or produce secondary resources such as education or working in an office. Like, we're not directly making food. We are eating food that people somewhere else make. In a way, it becomes a very complicated method of labour exchange. Someone else makes the food, I teach the sociology, someone else fixes the sick people. And society is an interconnected network of everyone performing these roles. So social change then is desirable. As society increases and gets bigger, there need to be more ways of understanding and managing the family unit, the distribution of wealth, and those kind of mechanisms. However, according to the structural functionalist perspective, rapid social change, especially stuff characterised as revolution, threatens the social order. So, following a functionalist perspective, it can be seen that although social problems weaken a society's stability, they don't actually reflect fundamental faults in how the society is structured. And solutions to social problems should take the form of gradual social reform rather than sudden and far-reaching change. And as I mentioned before, in the context of crime, despite their negative effects, social problems also often serve important functions for society. So there's two main ways in which a structural functionalist would understand social problems as arising. One of these is the term social pathology. Social problems arise from some sickness in society, which is most commonly attributed to poor socialization and or poor social control. And in this regard, the sickness can be attributed to individuals or groups. It could also be associated with social conditions and the failure of institutions like the family, the church, workplaces, etc. So an example of this sort of social problem would be, say, riots, like the immediate breakdown in society, like poverty combined with a lack of police presence combined with a heat wave could lead to riots and people smashing windows and stealing things. So social pathology in this way. There is a sickness in society, poor socialization, which is marginalized social groups, usually another aspect of the conservatism of the theory. But so marginalized social groups with poor socialization and then poor social control over those social groups can lead to social pathology and social problems. The other form of social problems described under a social structuralist, functionalist perspective is that of social disorganisation. Rapid social change is viewed as disrupting key bonds and norms, which generates conflict, and then society is in a state of anomie or normlessness. And I suppose the example is in the late 60s and the hippies, the flower children generation, suddenly leaving their families and going and living into communes, and social harmony being disrupted by the breaking away of small groups from the main of society and thinking that there was a different way of living. So overall, social problems generally arise from sick, as in dysfunctioning people, poorly functioning institutions, or too much social change too quickly, which generates weak norms. So overall then, just to touch base back on a few of the key assumptions in structural functionalist theory. Society is a self-maintaining system, like it is already in its equilibrium state. It wants to continue like this. Another key assumption, intervening in the key elements of that equilibrium through rapid social change is a risk. Another key assumption is that social control should be privileged at the expense of individual agency. The important thing, according to this theory, is that society is in balance and continues to function. And then finally, the last main assumption I want to highlight is that societal conflict and cultural diversity are meant to be kept to a minimum in favour of universal social components, such as shared norms and values, social integration and cultural assimilation. Every society, like every organism, is already in its perfect stasis point. Okay, so we can see that there are quite a few fairly or negative or conservative applications of this theory, as when we looked at the ideas of poverty and crime and what role they might play for society as a whole. There are a few useful, I think, still elements to it. Like when we look at any society or any culture, by looking at it from a structural functionalist perspective, we can focus on the functions of social structures and how they interact, which is certainly a useful perspective to be able to use. The underlying assumption of society as an organism that's healthy when all the parts are fulfilling their necessary functions, this one I think you can debunk. I mean, even when you rely on the metaphor of the body, like there are parts of the body that don't really do anything, like the appendix, it just sits there. Like the body wasn't created with all of its bits put together like a watch, neither is society. On the other hand, it is useful to be able to understand and identify and sometimes even apply this assumption, because, as I've said, that we do seem to still to have this tendency within wider society to understand society in this way. Like, if I was to describe to you the role of the justice system in Melbourne, like if I was to say to you, police are there to keep law and order, it's a primary school child's explanation, but it does tend to be like one of the more toned down, simplified explanations that we have and still use for how society all fits together. And then finally, the final assumption, the final element that I want to touch on around structural functionalism, which kind of leads into next week's topic. There is, in structural functionalism, this underlying assumption that all the members of society agree on what is the social good, and so everyone works together towards the social good, which doesn't leave much space for revolution, conflict, or productive dissent. So I'll draw on the example from a couple of years ago when marriage got legalised. This was a case in which there was already social change happening, and it went, though, to referendum for some reason to get proof that everyone could agree that marriage should be legalised. This allowed like different members of the public to put forward their opinions. Marriage equality was legalised, making us one of the last Western countries in the world to finally do it. But at the same time, during the campaign, there were a lot of dissident voices, people saying that, on the one hand, people should be allowed to get married if they love each other. On the other hand, people saying that marriage itself is a conservative institution and we should be fighting to get rid of marriage rather than making it broad spread across the board. And then people arguing that marriage is a sacred institution and should be restricted to simply being between a man and a woman. So with these different and dissenting views, it's clear that not everyone in society agrees on what is the social good. Each of these groups has their own idea of what is the social good, and each of them fights hard for it. But according to a structural functionalist perspective, this kind of dissent indicates that the underlying problem, that there is an underlying problem or sickness, as in a properly functioning, properly ordered and properly maintained society, there wouldn't be this dissent. Now, next week we're going to take a brief look at a theory in which conflict and dissent are seen to lead to positive social change. We're going to have a little bit of a look at Marxism as a theory that sees social change as arising from conflict and dissent. So instead of, as in structural functionalist theory, where everyone has to agree on the social good and where social institutions are in place to maintain society in its current form, we're going to look at Marxism as a theory that's all about social change and that sees conflict and dissent as productive because they lead to the possibility of revolution, social change, and seeing history, in fact, of being as a series of stages of revolution and rapid-paced social change. So, thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you next week.